What is up, everybody? This is Nick from P2W Fantasy, doing a rare Week 10 preview on a Sunday. So I figured had some time here. Little one's passed out, hanging out with her mom right now. So I figured be a good time to go live, talk some football while I have some free time, and preview all the games coming up this week. So rocking the P2W gear. You can find it on the pin tweet if anybody's interested in buying a t-shirt and sending a selfie saying, hey, I'm rocking P2W. That'd be badass. But let's get into it here. So already out for the week via sleeper, Christian McCaffrey. We knew about that already. Hopefully it is a short absence. I know I've had Christian McCaffrey in 3 leagues. I moved him in 1. I mean, I don't have a ton of patience, obviously, in redraft, but hoping McCaffrey's back next week. So Mike Davis obviously gets a big big bump in his work. If you dropped him because McCaffrey was back, might have been a little bit of an error there. I actually picked him up for free in a league because people in one of the home leagues didn't pay attention to McCaffrey being out. So Mike Davis gets a bump there. Kenny Galladay out again with a hip. Not sure what the length of that is. It's not like a hamstring or like he tweaked his quad or some sort of ankle injury. So the hip injury is a big question mark there. Some would say Marvin Jones gets a bump, but I think it's more of an Amendola and TJ Hawkinson sort of boost in playing time and production there. Joey Bosa on defense, obviously. Devonta Freeman, so Wayne Gallman. Perfect timing. Thoughts on Gallman this week? Perfect timing. From Cooter Doodle. So Gallman's interesting because looking at a league right now, he's projected 9.5 against the Eagles. So the Eagles have been decent defense as far as fantasy goes. But look at Gallman the past 3 weeks. So week 7, 16.4 points, week 8, 13.2, and then week 9, 14.7. So he did have a touchdown in all 3 of those games. Not to say that he for sure will not have a touchdown, but I think the interesting thing here is that he's under-projected a bit. I think 9.5 after having very productive weeks gives him a little bit of an under-projection there. But I think if he's the lead back, I think you should be optimistic with flexing him this week. I don't know if he's going to be a week winner, but I'd have no problem flexing him, especially if you're in a pinch with these injuries and a lot of people on bye weeks. So Gallman's not a bad play, especially looking at the last 3 weeks. A little bit more touchdown dependent, but there is some optimism for him to score above the projection there. So you could do worse with your flex position. David Johnson's out, so Duke Johnson finally gets a lead back role for the duration of David Johnson being out because they don't really have a lot of backs there. Deebo Samuel's still out, so it'll be interesting to see what does Richie James do. He had that massive 30-plus point week last week, which surprised a lot of us, especially me, who started Trent Taylor in a deep league and got burned by that. So that wasn't super hot. And then Raheem Mostert out. Look for Jerick McKinnon to get a good boost this week. JaMychal Hassey's looked very average to below average, in my opinion, in his touches that he's played. I know he got a lot of hype going into these weeks as potentially the lead back. So we'll look into the games now for the NFL schedule. I'm just going to pull that up. A lot of decent games today, starting off with Texans and Browns. So this will be an interesting game, I think. Both teams are going to throw the ball a lot just because the Texans defense isn't really doing too well this year against the opposing offense. And Deshaun Watson is a guy that's going to have to throw. Will Fuller and Brandon Cooks, I talked about this in the pod this week. They look like 2 of the best wide receivers in the league right now. I mean, they're not DK Lockett level, but I think they're right up there just because they've been so productive. The guy I like in this game a lot, he was one of my starts of the week, is Brandon Cooks. You look at Brandon Cooks' last couple games here. So starting off in week 5 is where he found his production. He had 12 targets in that game. And then the rest of the game, so from weeks 5 through 9, 12 targets in week 5. They had the bye in week 8. The rest of the games, he had 9 targets. So that's solid volume and it's consistent. I think for fantasy purposes, you have to look for guys that are getting consistent volume there. Are you concerned about the win in this game? I know there was some games that the wind was a massive factor in. So, you would think that it goes to the ground a bit, but at the same time, I think we'll know the actual conditions closer to game time. So I'd still be optimistic about some of these pass catchers. I think they're going to have to throw the ball and find a way to throw the ball. So not everything can be on the ground, but you do have to factor in the wind at times. It has affected games, but it shouldn't prevent you from starting guys, I don't think. Back to Cooks, though, again, 30.1 week 5, 21.8 week 6, week 7, 13, which was the worst, which still isn't that bad. And then week 9, 17.3. So he's very, very productive lately. Obviously, Will Fuller, going into the year right now, is the wide receiver 14. So he's been solid too. But I think this duo is very good, with Cooks being a little bit slept on right now. Jarvis Landry looks to be the wide receiver 1. But I will say in this game, Austin Hooper is back. He had that appendix issue, which was out of nowhere. But if you look at Austin Hooper's last 3 games here, he had 5 catches in all 3 of those games. The targets looked like 7, 10, 6. So he was much more involved in comparison to weeks 1 through 3, where he was barely involved in that offense. So I think Austin Hooper gets a nice bump in this offense now that he's healthy. Obviously, Harrison Bryant stepped in and looked pretty good in the one game. But Hooper's going to be a bigger part of this offense than he started the season as. So another good play, I think, on the week. Higgins or Chark this week? Oof. So this one's interesting because Chark had a nice game last week with Luton. I had that massive play. I think I turned on red zone, and the first play I saw was a massive throw by Jake Luton to Chark, and everyone's like, "Oh man, this guy's ready to go in the league." But that was good. That looked good. But Higgins, I think, is sneaky this week because the Steelers' defense is very good. Obviously, Tyler Boyd is the wide receiver 1 of the team. So that might leave some space on the field for Higgins, and he's had those big play abilities and options. I like what Jake Luton did in his first game, but it comes down to, can he do it in 2 games? Can he do it in 3 games? So I'm not going to say Jake Luton's a bad play this week at all in deeper leagues, and he's not going to be a poor quarterback, I don't think, by any means, but being more optimistic about Joe Burrow connecting to Higgins today versus DJ Chark, I think I'm going to go Higgins on this one. That's a good question right there. What's the next game on our slate here? So we went over the Texans and the Browns, Washington and Detroit. Super sexy game that everybody's been dying to watch. Not knocking Washington or Detroit at all. I'm a Bears fan, so sometimes I throw in these little digs. The first guy I want to talk about, though, is J.D. McKissick. My buddy, my brother, Anthony P2W. I used to rip on McKissick. No problem, man. No problem at all. I used to rip on McKissick a little bit because I thought he was just a super average option in deeper leagues, like a flex. Gibson was the hot commodity. But if we look at McKissick over the past couple of weeks here, week 7, nothing great to talk about against Dallas. That was just an iffy game in general. But this last week against the Giants, he had 9 receptions. So I play in all PPR leagues. If you play in a PPR league, that's interesting to see. If he's going to swallow that many targets, and I think he was targeted like 14 times in that game. If you plugged in a wide receiver on a given week and he caught 9 balls, you'd be happy with that. So seeing a running back who also is going to rush, he rushed the ball 3 times, so nothing crazy, but he still rushed the ball 3 times on top of catching more passes than a wide receiver. So I think McKissick is an interesting option, especially with Alex Smith, who looked like a check down king in that game to him. So I don't see that changing. He's had 6+ catches in 1, 2, 3, 4 games this year. And if we look at some trends here in that offense with Alex Smith, I think McKissick is a good play this week. And I think he's a little bit slept on to what he's actually been producing because he's not that hot rookie Antonio Gibson name. Another guy I like in this game a lot is TJ Hawkinson. He did have a toe injury, so you go into these games sometimes with these guys and say, hey, he's been banged up at practice. He missed some time. I don't know how his production is going to be. I think he's just a professional football player. I think he's a very good football player. So TJ Hawkinson is a guy I think can be a very, very good tight end option this week. I think he could be a top 3 tight end option this week. Last couple of games, super productive. Week 7, he scored 16.9. Week 8, 13.5. And week 9, 14.9. So the past Across his past 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 games, he scored a touchdown in all 5 of those games. He's got 5 touchdowns on the year. 1, 2, 3. I can't count. Four touchdowns in the last 5 games. He has 5 touchdowns on the year. But seeing those numbers, week 7 through 9, he's got to be a top 5 across those weeks easily. The target volume is very good. 5, 6, 10, 8. So Kenny Golladay is out. Everyone, likes to think, hey, Marvin Jones got to get a massive bump. Who else is in there? Danny Amendola. TJ Hawkinson's been targeted a lot, so I'm rolling with him. Start 2. Godwin, Thielen, Parker, and Judy. Interesting. This is tough for me. It's a mix here between Godwin, Thielen, and Judy for me. I'm going to leave Parker out of this one, even though Parker could easily be a great option too. I love what Judy did last week. I think he could do it again this week. I might go Thielen and Judy. I'm going to throw a dart on that one, even though Godwin is obviously a target monster. It's just those weeks can fluctuate now that you got so many guys in the mix. Judy it's Godwin, Thielen, and Judy because Judy was banged up. I'd pay attention to what they say before the game because he's questionable going into the game. Thielen, I think, is a guy you would plug in even with the Bears defense, but that's a tough one right there. Right there. I'd pay attention to Judy and see what his status is going into the game. Jefferson, Parker, Cooks, win concern. Fulgham, Jeffrey back, and half PPR. So Jeffrey is back, but pay attention to Rieger's role in this offense. I think Rieger's going to have a good game this week. I think he's going to be the number 1 waiver wire target following this week, especially coming off of a bye. And, now he's back. I think he slept on a little bit. Jefferson, you look at the Bears defense and say, hey, they don't give up a ton all the time to the pass. I'm going with Cooks is one of them, even with the win concern, just because of how awesome he's been across the last couple of weeks. I think over the last few weeks, he's been like the wide receiver 9. He's been going off. I'm gonna fade Fulgham. A lot of people are gonna get mad about that in this. I think just because you got more pass catchers involved now. Dallas Goedert's back. Miles Sanders is involved in the offense. How does that shake things up? I think Fulgham doesn't have to be the guy anymore, even with Rieger being on his second healthy game. So I'm gonna go with Cooks, and I might go with Jefferson because of the upside, because we saw Jefferson in 2 weeks now score 30 plus. So Jefferson has shown that he can win you a week. And I think if you're looking into the season now, we're in week 10, you're probably fighting for some sort of standings position going into playoff contention. So I think with a guy like Jefferson, he can win you a week. So I might go with Jefferson on that one, just because of the upside that we've seen. Even though, Tua looked very good last game, so him and Parker might be a thing. I thought him and Preston Williams looked super good, but now he's out, so that's an interesting one right there. Moving forward, you got the Buccaneers and the Panthers. One guy I'm going to talk about that was slept on a bit. Even myself kind of faded him off a little bit just because of the guys involved in the offense. Is Curtis Samuel's been going off in fantasy across the last couple weeks. Week 7, 17.3 points. Week 8, 21.4. And week 9, 26.8. So if you're a DJ Moore manager, you're a little bit disappointed to see this sort of production just because he hasn't has consistent production in fantasy across these weeks. One thing to also keep in mind is that Christian McCaffrey's out of this game. And Curtis Samuel's been used like Debo was at times last year. This big gadget guy who's going to rush the ball. He's going to line up outside. He's going to line up in the slot. He's going to be lining up in the backfield for catches. They are using Curtis Samuel in so many different ways that I think he's such a good fantasy option right now. And the fact that Christian McCaffrey's out, Mike Davis obviously was very good for a while in fantasy. But look at the carries for Curtis Samuel. 7 in 3 games, and he's had 2 rushing touchdowns in the last 3 games. So obviously you don't count on that on a weekly basis. But if this guy's scoring the way he is, roll with the hot hand. I think Matt Rule, the coach over there, likes using Curtis Samuel in different ways. So if that's the case, I think he's a great flex play on a weekly basis until he proves you otherwise. Teddy Bridgewater's been pretty good. It's a good Bucs defense, but at the same time, if you're really looking for a streamer, I think Bridgewater could be a good one, even against a good Bucks defense. But again, that's if you're really in a pinch with these bye weeks or some sort of injury related issue happening in on your team here. The Bucks pass catchers are very interesting to say the least because we don't know exactly where the targets are going to go. I did kind of not talk against Chris Godwin, but I did talk a little bit about how he has some competition and we have these question marks going in. But Chris Godwin is a target monster usually. Across his healthy games, 7 targets, 6 targets, 7 targets, 9 targets, and 6 targets. So that's a lot better than his counterpart, Mike Evans, who's had a fluctuation of targets throughout the year. He's had some games where he had 10, like week 2, Mike Evans had 10 targets, but then he goes back-to-back weeks 6, 7 with 2 targets. So it's very inconsistent in comparison to Godwin. So if you're juggling one of those two guys, Godwin's a safer option. Mike Evans might have a little bit more of a bump on the upside if he can get into the end zone. We saw week 2, 23.4 points, and week 4, 25.2. He had a touchdown 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks in a row in fantasy. So weeks 1 through 5, he had a touchdown. So that's the upside with Mike Evans. A lot of guys were trying to fade him at times. People were suggesting to drop him, which made 0 sense. But Mike Evans is a good play if you really are reaching in a league. So sometimes, which is a good point to talk about in fantasy here, you go into the week and you're projected a lot lower than your opponent. This might be because of bye weeks, injuries. Maybe you're first in like one of the top 2 teams in the league. So sometimes you got to reach for points a little bit. You got to look for guys that have a bigger upside. If there's a wide receiver you can play that's safe, that's nice. If a guy can get you a consistent somewhere between 10, 12, 13 points. But if you're in a matchup where you need points, maybe you're looking at a guy like Mike Evans, who a lot of people are fading just because there's more of an upside there if he finds the end zone. So something to consider going into these weeks here. Next game here, I have the Eagles versus the Giants. Talked about Gallman a little bit. Touch on him brief. He's projected 9.5 in the standard PPR ESPN league, but across the last couple weeks, 16.4. 13.2 and 14.7. So do I think he's going to come out and score 30? No, I don't. But I think 9.5 is a little bit lower than what he actually could produce. On the flip side, Miles Sanders is back. Miles Sanders is very good in fantasy when he's healthy and good to go. We saw in week 2, 20.1 points. Followed that up with 14.7. His lowest was 9.6 in week 4. 23.9 against the Pittsburgh defense in week 5. And then 12.2 against Baltimore in week 6. So he went back-to-back and got some solid defenses, but Miles Sanders is a great fantasy option when he is actually healthy and playing. So I think Miles Sanders could be a top 5 running back this week. I'm not sure that you have to be concerned about him coming back from injury and think that, hey, they still might use Scott. Not something I'd be super worried about right there. I think Miles Sanders is geared up to have a massive week. Evan Ingram's interesting at the tight end position in this game. The tight end 11 right now. Last few weeks, what I like a lot about him is there was question marks about his involvement. So we saw in week 5 and week 6, he had 2 and then 3 targets. So nothing to be too super excited about right there. It fluctuated because in week 4, he had 10 targets. And then the week before that, he had 5. So he's been up and down. But lately, 3 games in a row with 9+ targets. So he's had 9, 10, and 10 targets across the last 3 games. Hasn't been scoring like crazy. He's got 10+ points in those 3 games. But last game, he had 15.8. So I think if he has 9, 10 targets in a game, what's missing might be a touchdown. And if he gets that, he's having a huge week for you at the tight end position, which is definitely necessary at times. So Evan Ingram's a decent play this week in this game, especially just with that target volume being consistent across the last couple of weeks. A guy I like to talk about as far as the wide receivers go, obviously Travis Fulgham's been very good in fantasy, came out of nowhere, scoring a lot of points. He's winning weeks for people. Jalen Reagor, I think, is going to have a massive breakout game this week. The reason I think Jalen Reagor is going to have a massive breakout game this week is because week 8, when he's finally back, he missed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks of football. He came back and had 6 targets. He only caught 3 of them and not for a lot of yards, but he did score a touchdown. So being back from injury and having 6 targets right away, I think is it's a very, very good sign. 13.2 points last week. And then they hit the bye. So in your fantasy league, a lot of guys might have forgot about Jalen Reagor, the guy that they went and grabbed in this past draft. They said, hey, we want Jalen Reagor. We don't want Justin Jefferson for whatever reason. And you know what? Reagor is one big play waiting to happen. He didn't have a lot of yards last game, but he came back from an injury. So seeing that he had 6 targets, Jalen Reagor is going to break out this week. That's going to be my, not a hot take, but that's going to be my call it right now sort of thing there. So if you're looking again for some upside in this week, I think Reagor's a good play. I think he's a good play who can outscore his projection. I think he's projected like 11. I think it could be a week where he scores 15 plus. So let's go on to the next game. We got the Jaguars versus the Packers. My man, James Robinson. I took a, not heat, but people were commenting because I posted this picture from ESPN. It said the top 3 rookies right now for the Rookie of the Year race. And it was Justin Herbert, correct. Number 2, Joe Burrow, correct. And then number 3 was Justin Jefferson, which I thought was incorrect. Justin Jefferson had some great weeks of fantasy. He had 2 games of 30 plus, and then he had an okay like 14-point game. But he's also had a bunch of average to below average games. So I'm not taking anything away from Jefferson, but I think it just was a little bit disrespectful to what James Robinson has done this year. So when you look at the running back position, I know there's been some injuries. McCaffrey's missed a lot of weeks. Saquon Barkley tore his ACL. Zeke's team is up in shambles right now. But you have to give credit where credit's due, and James Robinson is the running back 4 on the year. Running back 4. So if anybody would have guessed that James Robinson before the season would have been running back 40, you would have been looked at a little bit strange there. So he's a running back 4 right now, scoring a lot of points, averaging 18.7 points. He's involved in the passing game. He didn't catch a ball last week, but he had 25 rushing attempts. So if you look at some of the touches here, 22 in week 7, 22 carries, 4 catches. Week 4, 17 carries, 4 receptions. So he's very, very, very involved in all aspects of the Jaguars offense. He's probably the most important piece of them right now, just from a volume standpoint. So week 7, he had 31.7. This past week, 15.9. Back in week 3, he had 30.9. James Robinson is a must play every week, and I think he's going to be very good against the Packers. Gemmo, the icon. What's up, buddy? He's jumping in there. Good friend of mine there. Alan Lazard's going to be interesting. I don't know. Was he ruled out? Was not activated. All right. Scratch that. Scratch that. Let's talk about briefly here Aaron Rodgers. Aaron Rodgers is in the MVP race, and that's not something I'd like to talk about as a Chicago Bears fan, but in fantasy, he's a quarterback 5 right now, averaging 23.3 points. What he's done in this offense without even having Devonta Adams for at least a game or 2. 1-2 games missed by Devonta Adams. He's been awesome, Aaron Rodgers. So I think against Jacksonville, he's a good quarterback play this week, and not just a good one, a great one. Devonta Adams is proving to be the scariest wide receiver in fantasy. If you're playing against Devonta Adams, you are nervous going into the week just because that guy goes off almost every week. Look at the last 3 weeks. Week 7, 44.6. Week 8, 30.3. Week 9, 33.3. That is insane. That production is insane. He literally, if you have Devonta Adams, he's winning you your matchups. You can throw him into your lineup and then plug in like me and Mila, my baby, and then a random other wide receiver. You probably still win that week. Flex spot, go to Fitz or wait for Harris, New England running back news for tonight. Interesting. The bad thing about Harris is he's going to be touchdown dependent because he doesn't catch the ball. He looked pretty good, but he's also hurt a bit, so that's a big juggling point right there. I think Fitz is a safer option just because Baltimore is a great defense too. So if Harris is a little bit banged up, he's a little bit dependent on touchdowns. He's not going off on weeks. He's not giving you like 20. I mean, Fitz is not giving you much either, but I think he's going to be involved at least a little bit here. 9.4 last week. The week before, 14.2. Back in week 2, he had 12. So I think the safer play would be Fitz, but I guess if you want a little bit more upside to throw a dart on, you can go Harris and then maybe hope that, Burkhead or James White, or maybe I don't know what the status on Sony Michel is. You might throw a dart and say, hey, if it's not Damian Harris, maybe I can grab somebody else to stash him on the bench for tonight. So you just got to be careful with that if you're going to throw that one out there. Let's see our next game here to talk about. Bills Cardinals. So the interesting question people had was, who will be the better quarterback this week? Will it be Josh Allen or will it be Kyler Murray? Kyler Murray is the number 2 quarterback in fantasy compared to Josh Allen, who is the number 4. Very close in production there. I'm going Josh Allen this week. I think versus Arizona, I mean, going off of last game against Seattle, obviously it's Seattle's defense. Seattle's defense gives up the most points to fantasy quarterbacks. Most of us know that. I think Josh Allen's going to have another good game. 81.6 passing completion rate last game. That's crazy. That's crazy for a guy that everybody said can't throw the ball accurately. He's had a couple other games this year where he's 70 plus. So 1, 2, 3 other games he was 70 plus. Stephon Diggs, we can talk about DeAndre Hopkins and how great he's been, but Stephon Diggs being the wide receiver 4 right now, his target volume is crazy. Last game, 12 targets. The game before, 9. Week 7, he had 11. And then jump back to week 5, he had 16. And week 2, he had 13. His target volume is crazy. Looking at Hopkins, obviously he has great volume too. But last game, you wonder like what happened. He had 3 targets. Was he banged up or something? I'm not sure about that. He had 12 in week 7. He had 12 in week 3. So total targets on the year, Hopkins has 76 compared to Diggs. Diggs has had 91. So a big jump in target share there. Stephon Diggs is just going off this year. He was one of the guys in the preseason. I was putting high on my rankings, and I really was optimistic about Diggs. I think I slept on Hopkins a little bit because I didn't know about how the connection would be, but it's been good there too. Zach Moss over Devin Singletary for this game this week. Zach Moss has been much more productive in terms of scoring touchdowns. 3 touchdowns rushing, 1 receiving. So he's got 4 in comparison to Devin Singletary's 1. I think the touches have been in Zach Moss's favor. So I'd be nervous plugging in Devin Singletary because you don't know if he's going to be the second running back in the system, and he's not been scoring touchdowns. So if you have 2 guys in a committee right now and one's scoring and one is not, I'm probably not going to play the one that's struggling to score points here. So that'll be interesting too. Another guy I slept on a lot this year that's been pretty productive is Christian Kirk. I think he can beat his projection here. So he's projected 11.8 points. But if we look at some of his other games, the last 3 games, he scored 20 plus points. So if he's projected 11.8, his last 3 have been 20 plus. I'm going with him beating his projection. The targets the last 2 games were very good, 8 targets apiece. The game before, he only had 3, but he did score 2 touchdowns. So across the last 3 weeks of football, he's had 2, 4, 5 touchdowns in 3 weeks. So obviously we can't count on that to happen on a weekly basis. But if he's finding the end zone, I mean, that gives you room for optimism. I wasn't too high on him before. He had 2 really bad weeks in a row to start the season, but 20 plus in the last 3 weeks. I think Christian Kirk is a guy that you can give or get some upside out of. All right, next game ahead here. This is going to be a fun one to watch. I wish I can promote Bang. I tried to reach out to them. They said, no, we're not giving anybody a sponsorship, but here's a coupon. So got something out of it. But it is Tua versus Herbert this week. 2 rookie quarterbacks going at it. I love that. So Tua T, his first game as a starter, 5.72 points. The defense went crazy that game. He didn't have to throw the ball a lot. They won against the Rams, and they really just beat them up, so he wasn't demanded to play that much as far as throwing the ball. But this last game, 20 for 28. So that's awesome as far as completion percentage goes. And he threw 2 touchdowns. He rushed the ball 7 times, which a lot of people were a little bit sketched out about, hey, can he actually run? How is he, as far as his mobility goes? But 7 rushes for 35 yards. And I know one of the plays he juked somebody out of their shoes. So he looked pretty good. 21.42 points in that game. On the flip side, Justin Herbert being the quarterback 10 right now, and he had his bye for 1. and he didn't play week 1. So the fact that he is quarterback 10, he missed the first game because he wasn't the starter, and then he also had his bye is scary to me. The guy's averaging 24.3 fantasy points. He's had no games this year where he threw the ball less than 264 yards. So the passing volume's there, the yards are there, and the guy's just balling out on a weekly basis in terms of what his average fantasy point production is. So the last 3 games, he's had 8 touchdowns. 8 touchdowns in the last 3 games. He's had 2 turnovers. So 8-to-2 ratio. He's very good right now. One wide receiver that, obviously you can't pick him up on waivers. He'd be a hard guy to trade for right now, but is the wide receiver 7 in Keenan Allen. Keenan Allen, I think, was slept on, including myself going into this year. We know he's good. We know he's been good. I think with Tyrod Taylor, we didn't know what was going to happen, but Keenan Allen being the wide receiver 7, it's well-deserved. And we talked about target volume and consistency in the target game. Look at some of these games he's had. Week 3, 19 targets. Week 4, 11. Week 7, 13. Week 8, 12. And week 9, 11. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 games with 10-plus targets. And then he's had a game where he had 19 targets. That's insane. The last 3 games, he's caught the ball 10 times, 9 times, and 9 times. So Keenan Allen is a matchup winner as of late. I mean, the guy's insane right now with his volume and his ability to connect with Justin Herbert. Mike Williams is interesting in this game as well, just because Mike Williams, he can give you a lot, 21 points in week 8, or he can give you a little, week 7, 1.4 points. So that's a big gap right there. Mike Williams, again, it's an offense that throws the ball a lot. I think we're just waiting for him to actually be a little bit more consistent in his involvement in the offense. I know he's dealt with some injuries. Hunter Henry has had 3 pretty sketchy weeks in a row. I actually like Hunter Henry a lot. I think it's a game that it could be a big Hunter Henry breakout game, so we're waiting to see what happens with that. He's just missing the touchdowns. Hunter Henry's been a guy that would pop off for 2 touchdowns in the past. We're just not really seeing it right now. So I think with the passing volume being so good, Hunter Henry is just having, a little bit of a misfortune there, not finding the end zone. DJ Dallas or J.K. Dobbins, sorry if already covered, just chimed in. That's an interesting one because DJ Dallas, I think he's expected to get a big bump in the role. It's going to be him and Travis Homer rotating with that. I think you go with DJ Dallas just because, last game he only rushed the ball 7 times. He did have 2 receptions as well, 11.9 points. He's going back-to-back weeks scoring a touchdown, so he's showing the ability to be relied on in that aspect of the game, so you like that. Week 8, he had 18 rushes for 41 yards. Not so good, but he did have the touchdown. He did have 5 catches in that game too. So I think with him and Travis Homer rotating in the backfield and him having that touchdown upside, that brings some optimism. J.K. Dobbins, I expected more out of last game. The week before, he had 13 points, I believe, in last game. Not too good. Mark Ingram is a guy to look into real quick. I think he had a good week of practice, they're saying, Mark Ingram. So he's expected to play. Does he get all the touches? No. I mean, we saw this year Gus Edwards has had just as many, if not more, touches than Mark Ingram. But J.K. Dobbins, I liked a lot going into the week or going into the year. 5.5 points this past week. He had 13.1 the week before. But he's had so many games where he scored 7, 8, 2, 8, 4. I think he's hard to trust, so I think I might just go with DJ Dallas on this one just because he's guaranteed to get the touches. He's scored the past 2 weeks, so they're going to rely on him to hopefully do the same. The offense is in a good field position for a lot of games just because Russell Wilson's throwing the ball downfield to his 2 receivers that are balling out this year. So I'm going to go DJ Dallas over J.K. Dobbins just because of the guaranteed touches there and not knowing with Mark Ingram back, is Dobbins going to be super involved? Is he not going to be involved? We don't know. Going off to the next game here, we got Broncos versus the Raiders. So one of my starts of the week, it actually wasn't my start of the week. It was Mila's start of the week. I'm doing a starts of the week with my daughter, Mila. She's 4 months old, and she has some good picks. But one of her starts of the week was Jerry Jeudy. Jerry Jeudy last week had his breakout game, 7 catches on 14 targets. 14 is the number to look at right there. 14 targets is awesome. That's great volume right there. The yardage for that game, 125 yards. He had a touchdown. So, he had a fluctuation of involvement this year. Jerry Jeudy started off 8, 7, and 9 for targets the first 3 weeks. Then the next 3 weeks, he was 4, 5, and 4. Seeing the last 2 games, he's had 24 targets in the last 2 games. If he's healthy, he's an awesome play this week. Just due to the involvement in the offense, his connection to Drew Lock, and I think that he's finally made himself known in the NFL as a guy who's going to make those big plays and get the yardage. Nelson Aguilar is like the only guy I'm looking at, I guess, for the wide receivers. Henry Ruggs has not really showed us anything so far. Brian Edwards, I think, was healthy last week and didn't even play, which was a question mark there. Nelson Aguilar has been a guy that scores, so he's had 5 touchdowns this year in the games, which gives you some optimism that he can find the end zone, even if he has 3 targets like he did last week. So 13.5 in week 9, but in week 8 he had 0, which is kind of scary. 21.7 the week before. So he's had a couple games as well where he scored 14 points. So that's interesting to see. And we'll see what his involvement will be. But I think he's the only wide receiver you can even think about right now until Henry Ruggs proves you otherwise. Josh Jacobs is a running back 10 right now. He's been pretty average, though, this year. He had that big 35.9 point game week 1. Week 5, he had 22.5. And then the last 2 weeks, 12.9 and 13.8. So he's not going off or anything right now. You have to start him if you have him on your roster. But I think we're waiting to see more out of this guy. I mean, him being projected as a potential top 5 like dynasty running back going into the year. I thought we were seeing more involvement in the passing offense. He went 4, 3, 3, 3 the first 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks of football. Then he had 2, and then he had 3 again, then 0, and then 1 catch. So we're not seeing a ton of involvement in the passing game, which is a little bit concerning for Jacobs. Devontae Booker is getting a little bit involved in this offense. Nothing crazy to say it's a committee or anything like that, but I think we are waiting to see Jacobs pick his play up a little bit more in terms of fantasy production. Melvin Gordon in this game. Not a big fan of Melvin Gordon. He's had 1 good game this year, 25.8. Started off the season with 15 and 16-ish points, but the last 3 games, 3.7 points, 10.7, and 12 points. So nothing great about Melvin Gordon. He's more of a flex guy if you're in a pinch than your actual starting running back, which you didn't really expect from him if you drafted him or if you have him on your team. It's a hard guy to sell right now, too. In terms of Noah Fant, I think he should be healthy, good to go. I like Fant in this game if he's ready to go as well. Across the last 3 weeks of football, he's had 19 targets, so that's pretty good for a tight end. Hasn't really gone off on any of those games, but I think with his involvement and just how sketchy the tight end position has been this year, I think he's a great play if you're in a pinch for tight ends. Next game, Seattle versus the Rams. It's one of the later afternoon games. This is going to be a big shootout. We know this. Seattle gives up the most points to quarterbacks, so obviously Jared Goff's an easy contender to be one of the top streaming options of the week. A great play as well. 10.2 points his last game, Jared Goff. We saw him score 23 plus points, though, in 1, 2, 3 weeks of football. On the year, he's got 13 touchdowns and 6 interceptions. He's had 2 rushing touchdowns as well. I think this is going to be a big game for Goff this week. I think Seattle giving up that many points to quarterbacks as far as fantasy goes this year is almost an automatic play for guys that are good to above average quarterbacks. So you like that. I love Robert Woods in this game. Robert Woods is going back to his big target volume production this past week like he used to be because he's been fluctuating a little bit. He's had weeks where he had 5 targets and 6 targets and 5 targets again. But week 8, he had 8 targets. So that's the typical Robert Woods that we like to see. Week 6, he had 10 targets. He's rushing the ball a lot this year, which was very interesting to see. I was surprised by how many times he's rushing the ball, but across the last 3 weeks of football, he's rushed the ball for 6, 8 times, and he's rushed for a touchdown. So he's the wide receiver 16 on the year. His counterpart here, Cooper Kupp, is the wide receiver 25. Kupp's had big target volume in some of these games. He had 20 targets in week 8, which is crazy. But he scored 22 points, which was actually behind Robert Woods. So even though Cooper Kupp's very involved in this offense as well, I like Robert Woods a bit better this year. Actually, for me, it's a lot just because I'm a big Robert Woods truther. Josh Reynolds is interesting in this game just because there's going to be so much passing volume. The last 2 games, Reynolds had 8 and then 9 targets. So if you're looking for a deeper option, LQ, what's up, brother? If you're looking for a deeper option, a deep league, maybe a flex play, I think Reynolds is interesting just because across those 2 weeks, 8 targets and 9 targets, the volume's been there. Kupp's been dealing with some injuries as well. Seattle's going to throw the ball a lot. Russell Wilson obviously is an MVP candidate. He's a QB3 on the year. Metcalf is going crazy this year as well. Obviously, the wide receiver 3. Lockett's been up and down, but his ups has bumped him to that wide receiver 5. Lockett's had games where he scored 37 and 53, which is insane. That game he scored 53. Again, you probably could have plugged in yourself, your wife, your kid, and Tyler Lockett, and you still probably won that week in fantasy. But then he's had a bunch of games where he's like last week, 8 points. The week before, 7.3, 8.4, 5.9. So he's looking like a boomer bust player. But the thing about Lockett is when he booms, he's winning your weeks. So you can't look at this dork. Ah, yeah, that's me. I feel like this is a Lockett game. It certainly could be. It's going to be a game where both teams are going to be slinging the ball. I mean, I don't think it's going to be a run game for either side. I think both teams are going to demand each other to throw the ball. So it could be a big Lockett game. And again, Lockett 37 and 53. DK is probably going to get the better matchup in terms of the cornerback as far as who the better cornerback is. So could be a good week for him. We talked about DJ Dallas already a little bit, but DJ Dallas has had 2 touchdowns in the last 2 games. The yards per carry have not been great in both games. Week 9 was a bit better, so maybe he's a little bit more comfortable in this offense here, but could be a big week. I don't really trust either one of the tight ends on each side. Tyler Higbee, a lot of guys like. I think, you have to have a touchdown because the targets are not there. Gerald Everett is getting more targets at times than Tyler Higbee. On the other side of the ball, people are talking about, Jacob Hollister stepping in. I'm not too optimistic about him either. So hopefully I'm wrong about that, but I'm fading both of those guys, both sets of tight ends at least. Next game here, Bengals versus the Steelers, which is going to be a very, very fun game to watch. One guy I'll talk about right off the bat here who's going to kill his projection, I think. Deontay Johnson is projected 12.8 points. He is the wide receiver 1 on this team, regardless if you want to admit it or not. In the games that Deontay Johnson is actually healthy, he's had 13 targets, which resulted in a touchdown and 23.2 points. That was in week 2. Week 7, he had 15 targets with 2 touchdowns and 29 points. This past week, week 9, he had 14.1 points on 10 targets and 77 yards. So Deontay Johnson's the wide receiver 1 when he's healthy. A lot of people have been frustrated about Deontay just because he's left so many games injured and missed some games here or there. He burned you pretty bad on weeks where he had to leave. Like week 5, he scored 0.8. In week 3, he scored 0.9. And you look at that just from looking at the stats. And if you didn't know, like, hey, he actually left the game early, you got burned on that. So Deontay Johnson is the wide receiver of the team. He gets the most targets when he's on the field. He's the guy you can trust the most, I think, in this offense because Chase Claypool, he's a big name. He's coming off of 2 good games, 13.2 and 15.3. He had that 42.6 game in week 5, but he's fluctuated a bit too. But he's more of a big play upside guy because the target volume kind of fluctuates a bit. We saw 13 targets in week 9, 11 in week 5, but then in between that, 4 and 1. So, I mean, his targets are up and down. So he's not a guy you can trust on a weekly basis, but I think he's geared up for a good week here. Juju's been a lot better across the last 3 weeks. He's had 17.5, 13.7, and 21.3 points. So he's been picking his game up. A lot of people were concerned about his involvement in the offense and his production. So I think you can start all three of those guys pretty comfortably. Even Eric Ebron, which a lot of people don't like to note too much because he's been a guy that's probably burned you in fantasy in the past. But Eric Ebron across the last 3 games has had 8, 5, and 6 targets, 11, 14.8, and 11.2 points. So he's had 2 touchdowns in the last 3 games. So Eric Ebron is not a bad play here. I'll start with Higgins here in the offense. Higgins is a wide receiver 29. He's had 14 plus in his last 3 games, and then 2 out of the last 3 games, he's had 18 plus. So the target volume's there with the 8, 5, 9. Week 5, he had 8 against Baltimore as well. It's been there almost all year. I think he's had 6 plus in all but 1 game out of his last 7 games. So that's very good out of Higgins. The defense is good. I think the defense knows that the wide receiver 1 is Tyler Boyd. So that might give Higgins a little bit more room to be successful, even though it's a great defense. But Tyler Boyd has been awesome in fantasy this year. He's a guy I liked going into the season. I think dynasty-wise, I think he's undervalued in dynasty just because he's connected to Joe Burrow very nicely. Wide receiver 13 again. Like I said, he's had 1, 2, 3 games this year where he's been 20-plus points. He had 27.74 against Cleveland in Week 7, 19.6 this past week. Back-to-back games with a touchdown. Tyler Boyd has been awesome in fantasy this year. I think that he's going to have another productive week in some sort of sense just because he's going to be throwing the ball a lot. So unless they completely shut down Tyler Boyd, I think that he's still going to be fine in fantasy this week. One interesting guy might have been a 1-week flyer, sort of a fluke, but Auden Tate last week had 7 targets and he caught all 7 of them. So in terms of how, that went, Brian Callahan said on Monday that Auden Tate has a role that needs to expand and will expand it. So I think deeper leagues, if you're looking for a guy with some upside that, you're really stretching to plug somebody in this week, he's projected 5.7 points. Might be a game where he could be a sneaky play. I'm not going to say in a standard, 10, 12-team league with short benches, you go get Auden Tate. But if you're in one of those 12-team like dynasty leagues and you're really in a pinch because of bye weeks and injuries, I think it's a fine play. Hamler or Curtis Samuel PPR. All right. So I talked about Curtis Samuel a little bit, so I'll go back into Curtis here. But he's being used in so many different ways, almost like this big gadget player like we've seen guys like Debo Samuel, like last year being used. But he gets a big bump that Christian McCaffrey's out because he's been rushing the ball a decent amount. Like I said earlier, he had 7 carries in the past 3 games, which isn't a ton, but he's had 2 rushing touchdowns in the past 3 games here. His targets have been 6, 5, and 9. He's had 17.3, 21.4, and 26.8 fantasy points in the past 3 games. So I know they're playing Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay is a good defense. I'm going Curtis Samuel just because he's been very, very good in fantasy. I think Coach Matt Rule has been using him in many different ways and wants to keep him involved in that offense. So Curtis Samuel for me, PPR purposes for sure this week. All right, we got the next game on the list here. 49ers versus the Saints. Obviously, Debo out again. Interesting for Richie James. Not sure how to read it. He's projected like 9.1 points. Last game, he had 33.4. What I liked about Richie James was that he was targeted 13 times. So sometimes, these no-name, I'm not saying he's a no-name, not to disrespect the guy, but we didn't really talk about him at all. But sometimes with these guys that are kind of under the radar, they come into a game, they score a big touchdown and have a couple targets, and then we're like, hey, do we grab him on waivers this week or what? But Richie James had 13 targets in that last game. So with Debo being out, I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens with Richie James in this game. Is he going to have another good game? Is he going to be targeted that many times? One guy I think is going to have a much better game is Jordan Reed. We saw back week 2 against the Jets. I know it's the Jets, but he still had 8 targets, caught 7 of them, 2 touchdowns. I think that's when Kittle might have been out that game, 24 points. This past week, he literally just was activated, so you can't say, hey, The guy scored 1.3 points. Well, what did you really expect from Jordan Reed? He just came off that knee injury and he was activated just for this game. So I think Jordan Reed is going to have a big bounce back game in comparison to the 1.3 points he had against Green Bay. Nick Mullins loved him back in that week 2 when he gave him 8 targets. So look for Jordan Reed to have a big bump in production. Michael Thomas is back. What does that mean for fantasy? I think it means that he's going to go back to his old ways. I think 10.1 points, you're like, hey, that's not the Michael Thomas I drafted in the first round of fantasy drafts. But, I mean, coming off of missing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 games and then the bye week, I don't think your expectations should have been like super, super high for him. But I think this could be a game that Michael Thomas gets back to his old ways in against the 49ers. We thought of them as this elite, top 1, 2, 3 defense. They're not really that anymore due to some injuries. So Michael Thomas, I think, is going to be obviously the same Michael Thomas that we're used to in this game here. The running back, McKinnon's going to get the most work. The past 2 weeks, he's at 13.9 and 15.8. So he's been pretty productive in the past 2 weeks, not rushing. In week 8, at least, he had -1 yards. But the week before, so week 9, he had an average of 4.3 yards per carry. That's not too bad. He had a touchdown in both games rushing. He caught the ball 7 times in 2 games. So, in my opinion, he's the only play at the running back position for the 49ers. JaMycal Hassey's been below average for pretty much his whole tenure here. He had 10.1 points in week 8. But if that's his ceiling right now in comparison to 3.7, 8.3, and 3.3, I'm fading JaMycal Hassey. I think he's droppable, and I don't have any optimism for him. So if you're a big Hassey truther, I'm sorry, but he's just not been good in fantasy. And we have the night game here, Lamar Jackson versus Cam Newton. Lamar Jackson, a lot of people have been slandering big time because he's been the quarterback 11. You drafted him to be the quarterback 1 or 2, and he's not been that. Last week, what was great to see was 82.6 completion percentage out of Lamar Jackson. So that's a good sign. No touchdowns, though, so that's not a good sign as far as passing touchdowns. He did have 1 rushing. So this year, first week, he had 27.5. He had 25 points in week 4. He had 28.24 in week 6. And then 18.6 his last game. But then everything else has been pretty below average to what you expect out of him. New England's defense is not the New England defense of what it was last year, so don't be worried about that. But I think it could be a good Lamar Jackson game. Marquise Brown is on, the kind of the shit list of a lot of fantasy managers just because he hasn't scored 10 points in the last 3 weeks of football. 19.8 in week 5. That was good. 15.1 the first week. I think this is a big statement week for Marquise Brown. I think you're on your kind of wit's end with him. So if Marquise Brown does not score well this week, I think you're benching him. It's not that he's playing the worst defense in the league and like he has to do good, but I think with him having all these bad games, I think you trust him in a flex position right now. But after this week, if he's not producing again, regardless of if it's his fault or Lamar Jackson's fault or Harbaugh's fault, whoever's fault it is, you're not playing him anymore after this week if he doesn't produce. But I think he's got the chance to be more involved. Lamar Jackson's been speaking about Hollywood, saying he needs to be more involved in this offense and that, he's a big part of the offense, but he hasn't really shown it consistently this year. So I think Marquise is a guy that either breaks out this week for a good game or you're benching him the rest of the year almost. Mark Andrews has been pretty awful as well. So the pass catchers just in general, the last couple of weeks of football have not been good for the Ravens. So I'm hoping that the passing offense improves under Lamar. But if not, I feel like you're just fading them, which is unfortunate because you're already fading the running backs in that system just because there's been 3 guys involved. James White, on the flip side of the ball, has not scored 7 points in the past 3 weeks. I think you're fading him. Damian Harris is questionable going into the game. He had a good week 8 where he had 16.2 points. Other than that, though, he's not catching the ball or anything like that, so I think you're fading them. Jacoby Myers is a guy to have a little bit of optimism for. I thought N'Keal Harry was going to have a better year, but he's not been good in games. He's been healthy, and then he's also not been healthy. So Jacoby Myers this past week had 14 targets and caught 12 of them on his birthday, ironically. 28.9 points on that week. So he had a massive game against the Jets. Obviously, it's the Jets, so you're like, oh, well, their defense isn't good. Doesn't take away the fact that he caught balls and made plays. The week before, he had 13.8. So he's coming off of 2 good weeks. So I think the only real offensive player that you have optimism for in this offense is Jacoby Myers, hopefully having a good game. Cam is the QB 21 on the year. He's playing a great Ravens defense. I have no optimism for Cam. I think in a 1-quarterback league, if you still have Cam on your roster, I'd be debating on dropping him because maybe not. I mean, you debate dropping him, but you're not playing him because if you're in a 10 or 12 team quarterback, 1-quarterback league, you should be starting a top 10, 12, maybe 15 quarterback. So if Cam's the quarterback 21 and there's 12 people in your league and you're starting the 21st best quarterback, that doesn't make sense to me. So I think Cam's a guy that you really should be. I know he's got a good name and he has his rushing ability, but he just hasn't been good in fantasy. Last game, I'm not going to go super deep into just because it's on Monday, but I will say I'm a big Bears fan, so I'm hoping the Bears bounce back. They've been pretty below average and kind of boring to watch the last couple of weeks. I think their defense has been great, but their defense is probably frustrated with that offense. So go Bears on Monday. Maybe talk about that game after the weekend. But good luck to everybody who tuned in to listen to me rant about all these games today. If you're just tuning in now, you can just play back the episode and zoom into one of your games. But if anybody has any last-minute starter sits or questions, I'll take them. I'll wait like 30 seconds for any sort of question and chill out here. But yeah, that's my week 10 preview. The interesting thing here is we're getting closer and closer to playoffs. So you're either in a pinch right now to win some games, or you're sitting comfortably, or you're somewhere in the mix of that. So fantasy playoffs coming soon. Don't want to be cliche with everything, but I do say play to win at this point of the year. You're either trying to fight for playoffs or you're not making playoffs, but you should still make a run for things. So thanks again for tuning in, guys. Good luck this weekend.